The Japanese occupation of Nauru was the period of 3 years during which Nauru, a Pacific island under Australian administration, was occupied by the Japanese military as part of its operations in the Pacific War during World War II. With the onset of the war, the islands that flanked Japan's South Seas possessions became a vital concern to Japanese Imperial General Headquarters, and in particular to the Imperial Navy, which was tasked with protecting Japan's outlying Pacific territories. The Japanese hoped to exploit the island's phosphate resources and to build up the military defenses in the area. They were unable to relaunch phosphate mining operations, but succeeded in transforming Nauru into a powerful stronghold, which United States forces chose to bypass during the reconquest of the Pacific. The most important infrastructure built by the Japanese was an airfield, which was the target of repeated Allied airstrikes. The war deeply affected the local population. The Japanese enforced a harsh regime, particularly on Chinese laborers who they saw as being at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. Forced labor and brutal treatment were commonplace. They decided to deport the majority of Nauru's indigenous population to the Truk Islands, hundreds of miles away, where mortality was extremely high. Still overpopulated with troops and imported laborers, the island was subject to food shortages, which worsened as the Allies' island-hopping strategy left Nauru completely cut off. Although effectively neutralized by Allied air and sea control, the Japanese garrison did not surrender until 11 days after the official surrender of Japan. Pre-war situation. Mining operations on Nauru began in 1906, at which time it was part of the German colonial empire. The island had some of the world's largest and highest quality deposits of phosphate, a key component in fertilizer, making it a strategically important resource on which agriculture in Australia and New Zealand depended. During the First World War, Nauru came under the control of the British Crown as a trusteeship of the League of Nations, effectively administered by the Australian government. The British Phosphate Commission, in charge of mining operations, joined with Australian officials and Christian missionaries to establish paternalistic management of the Nauruan people, who showed only limited interest in mining employment, and generally continued to rely on the traditional subsistence activities of fishing and agriculture. The BPC instead imported large numbers of indentured workers, mainly Chinese and Pacific Islanders. Modernity reached Nauru in the form of imported goods, which had the effect of making the locals increasingly dependent on the Australian economy. Beginning in the 1920s, the Nauruans received royalties for the mining of the lands, and income that allowed them to cover the needs, but which was minimal compared with the actual value of the island's phosphate exports. The population was decimated by several diseases against which they had no immune defenses. However, in 1932 they reached the population threshold of 1,500 that was considered necessary for the survival. This achievement is still celebrated in Nauru as Angam Day. In spite of the economic importance of Nauru for Australia and New Zealand, the island was left militarily unprotected, since a stipulation of the League of Nations mandate for Australian administration forbade the construction of coastal defences. The island, very isolated geographically, was not under constant surveillance by the Australian Navy, and was out of reach of aerial patrols. However, before the outbreak of hostilities in the Pacific Theatre, Nauru hadn't seemed to be under direct threat. The Empire of Japan became firmly established in the vast area north of Nauru as a result of the South Pacific Mandate of the League of Nations, and aggressive development of plantation agriculture in the islands was often facilitated by the use of Nauruan phosphate. Threats on Nauru. German attacks. The Second World War first reached Nauru in early December 1940 when two German armed merchantmen disguised as civilian freighters targeted the island. Their aim was to disrupt production of phosphate and thereby weaken the agriculture-based economies of Australia and New Zealand. Orion, Comet, and the supply ship Culminant headed for Nauru with the purpose of destroying the main infrastructure. Due to bad weather conditions, they were unable to make a landing on the island, but sank several merchantmen in the area. On the 27th of December, Comet returned to Nauru and, though again unable to land, a shore party severely damaged the mining facilities and exposed loading jetties with gunfire. The island's chief administrator, Frederick Royden Chalmers, a former lieutenant colonel in the Australian Army who had served in the Boer War and First World War, reportedly stormed along the waterfront hurling verbal abuse at the German ship, which slipped away unharmed. Declaration of war by Japan. For the Japanese, the importance of Nauru was twofold. First, they were interested in acquiring the island's phosphate deposits. Second, Nauru was potentially a good base from which to launch aerial attacks against the Gilbert Islands and to threaten the sea route between Australia and North America. The attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 marked American entry into the war in the Pacific. On the 8th, Japanese surveillance aircraft was sighted above the island. The first attack took place on the 9th of December. 3 planes flying from the Marshall Islands bombed the wireless station at Nauru, but failed to cause any damage. The Nauruans, warned by observers on Ocean Island 350 kilometers to the east, managed to seek shelter before the attack. The following day, another plane made a second attempt on the radio station. The third day, 4 planes made a low-altitude strike and finally destroyed it. During these 3 days, 51 bombs were dropped on or close to the station. The governor of the island, Lieutenant Colonel Chalmers, sent a message to Canberra stating that he thought the Japanese hadn't destroyed phosphate production facilities as they intended to occupy the island for its resources. All maritime contact with the rest of the world was interrupted. The BPC ship Trienza, en route with supplies, was recalled. Until the end of February 1942, there were daily sightings of Japanese planes over the island. In other parts of the Pacific Ocean, the Japanese advance rolled forward. They occupied the Gilbert Islands, northeast of Nauru, during Christmas 1941, and in January 1942 they took Rabaul, southwest of Nauru, and established a major base there. Nauru was therefore isolated, situated between the two main Japanese axes of advance. On the 19th of February 1942, the bombing of Darwin marked the first time in its history that Australia was directly targeted on a large scale by a foreign power. News of the attack caused deep consternation on Nauru. Evacuation of Westerners and Chinese following the British declaration of war on the Japanese Empire. The leadership of the British Phosphate Commission urged the Australian government to assist in the evacuation of BPC employees. The authorities were slow to respond, due to reports speculating that an invasion of the island by Japan was unlikely because of the lack of a deep-water port or an airstrip. The reluctance was also fueled by the belief that withdrawal of the Westerners would result in a loss of prestige for Australia among the Nauruans. The evacuation was finally approved at the end of January 1942. The initial plan was to remove all the Westerners and Chinese. Because of growing Japanese naval activity in the area, Triomphant, a destroyer operating with the Free French Naval Forces, was selected for the mission. The ship met with the BPC freighter Trienza, which was camouflaged in the Bay of Malakula in the New Hebrides Islands, loaded with 50 tons of supplies bound for Nauru. After taking some of Trienza's cargo cargo aboard, triumphant steamed at full speed toward Nauru, arriving on the 23rd of February. The unloading of supplies and boarding of civilians proceeded quickly. Contrary to the initial plan, it was decided to take aboard only part of the Chinese population, due to cramped conditions on the ship. 61 Westerners, 391 Chinese, and the 49 members of the British garrison embarked. 191 Chinese were left on Nauru, having been told they would be evacuated later, which, in the event, did not occur, due to the rapid pace of the Japanese advance. 7 Westerners, including Chalmers and 2 missionaries, chose to remain, feeling it was their duty to look after the islanders. Before evacuating, BPC employees thoroughly sabotaged the phosphate mining facilities.